In the old world, mercy was a virtue. In the ash, mercy is a mathematical error. I broke my own rules. I opened my heavy iron door to a man freezing to death in the snow. I fed him. I warmed his blood. And my reward was waking up to a locked door, an empty pantry, and the terrifying realization that I had just committed suicide by proxy. Isolation is not just a physical state. It is a structural modification of the human brain. When you spend enough time completely alone, surrounded by a world that actively wants to kill you, you stop being a social creature. You become an island of paranoid biology. You calibrate your entire existence around the preservation of a finite inventory. This much wood, this much water, this many calories. You build a wall of routine to keep the madness out. For 6 months after I left the apiary, I maintained that wall perfectly. I had relocated to a heavy, timber-framed ranger watchtower deep in the northern mountains. It was perched on a high ridge, surrounded by a dense, dead forest of blackened pine trees. It was a flawless tactical redoubt. The elevation gave me a commanding view of the valleys below. The thick timber walls, built from old-growth logs, were impervious to the howling winds. I had spent weeks hauling up heavy stones from a dry creek bed to build a reinforced fire pit in the center of the main room, venting the smoke through a rusted iron pipe I forced through the corrugated tin roof. I had my stockpile. I had lugged 60 pounds of the crystallized raw amber honey from the subterranean vault, packing it into scavenged heavy-duty plastic buckets. I had smoked and cured meat from wild game I managed to trap in the dead woods. I had melted snow. I was secure. I was an apex predator resting in an unbreachable den. But a den is also a prison. The winter hit with a ferocity that defied meteorological record. It wasn't just snow, it was an atmospheric assault. The temperature plunged to 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The wind shrieked against the timber walls with a continuous, high-pitched mechanical whine, sounding like a dying turbine. I was trapped inside the single room of the watchtower for 22 days without stepping outside. The claustrophobia began to gnaw at the edges of my sanity. The absolute silence of the room, contrasted against the chaotic screaming of the storm outside, created an auditory hallucination. I began to hear voices in the wind. I began to hear footsteps on the wooden wraparound deck. I dismissed them as the ghosts of an exhausted, isolated mind. Until the night the ghost knocked. I was sitting cross-legged in front of the stone fire pit, feeding small, meticulously measured splinters of dry wood into the meager flames. The fire was my clock. It kept time in a world without a sun. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howling wind. Asterisk thump. Scrape. Asterisk. It wasn't a branch breaking. It wasn't the shifting of the heavy timber settling in the cold. It was a distinct, deliberate physical impact against the heavy oak front door of the watchtower. I froze. The piece of dry wood slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the stone hearth. The sound was deafening in my ears. I slowly turned my head toward the door. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the Mossberg 500 shotgun resting beside my knee. The barrel was cold. I thumbed the safety off, my heart instantly hammering a chaotic, violent rhythm against my ribs. Thump. Scratch. It was the sound of something heavy dragging itself against the wood, followed by the desperate, weak scratching of fingernails. My tactical mind immediately assessed the threat. A feral dog pack? No, dogs don't scratch at doors. They pace and sniff at the threshold. A bear. The bears had starved to death a year ago. It was human. I stood up, moving with agonizing slowness, placing my boots carefully on the wooden floorboards to avoid making a single sound. I raised the shotgun, leveling it perfectly at chest height, pointed directly at the center mass of the door. I crept toward the heavy oak barrier. I pressed the side of my face against the freezing wood. "Help!" a voice whimpered from the other side. It wasn't a shout. It was barely a breath. It was a wet, ragged, pathetic sound, completely stripped of any threat or malice. It was the sound of a biological organism in the final, desperate throes of complete systemic failure. "Please," the voice rattled, barely audible over the wind. Cold. So cold. I stepped back from the door. The mathematics of the apocalypse were absolute. Opening the door meant breaking the seal. It meant letting the freezing storm inside. It meant exposing my location, my warmth, and my calories to an unknown variable. The rule was simple. If it isn't you, it's the enemy. But I had been alone for so long. The isolation had eroded the ruthless, ironclad logic that had kept me alive. The terrifying, crushing weight of the silence inside the cabin rebelled against my survival instincts. A microscopic, fatally flawed sliver of my humanity, the part of me that remembered what it was like to be a civilized man, to sit in a warm room and talk to another living soul, suddenly screamed for connection. If I let him die on my porch, I wasn't just killing a stranger. I was finally, irrevocably murdering the last piece of my own soul. I would become nothing more than a monster guarding a pile of sugar. I lowered the barrel of the shotgun. I reached out, my hand trembling violently, and gripped the heavy iron deadbolt. I hesitated for one final, agonizing second, calculating the massive risk I was about to take. Then I threw the bolt back. I grabbed the handle and yanked the heavy oak door inward. The storm exploded into the room. A horizontal wall of blinding white snow and freezing wind blasted my face, instantly extinguishing the small fire in the stone hearth and plunging the cabin into near darkness. Through the howling whiteout, a dark shape tumbled over the threshold, collapsing onto the wooden floorboards in a heap of snow and ragged cloth. I slammed the heavy door shut, leaning my entire body weight against it, fighting the sheer force of the wind, and drove the iron deadbolt back into place. The immediate silence inside the cabin was shocking. I stood with my back against the door, panting heavily, the shotgun gripped tight in my hand. I looked down at the floor. It was a man. He was curled into a tight fetal ball, shivering so violently his teeth chattered like a machine gun. He was wrapped in a pathetic, useless layer of thin, torn moving blankets and a rotting canvas tarp. The snow was packed into his beard and his hair, melting into freezing puddles on my floorboards. I had made my choice. The die was cast. I had broken the first rule of the wasteland. I had invited the outside world into my sanctuary. I slung the shotgun over my shoulder and knelt beside the freezing stranger, completely unaware that I had just signed my own death warrant. The wind outside the heavy oak door shrieked like a wounded animal, furious that I had robbed it of its prey. Inside the watchtower, the temperature had plummeted the moment I opened the door, extinguishing my small fire and leaving the room in pitch blackness. I stood over the shivering mass of wet blankets. My tactical mind was screaming at me to put a slug of 00 buckshot through the tarp and drag the body back out into the snow. That was the math of the old world dying. But the silent, crushing weight of my 6-month isolation had created a fatal crack in my armor. I was starving for the sound of another human voice. I slung the Mossberg 500 across my back, the cold steel barrel pressing through my jacket. I knelt beside the man. I grabbed the edge of the rotting canvas tarp and pulled it back. He was emaciated. His skin was a ghastly translucent blue, pulled tight over a skull that looked like it belonged in a mass grave. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his beard matted with solid ice. He wasn't just cold. He was in the final terminal stages of profound hypothermia. His body had stopped actively shivering and had entered the rigid, terrifying stillness that precedes cardiac arrest. If I didn't get heat into his core within 10 minutes, he was going to die on my floorboards, turning my moment of mercy into a gruesome chore of corpse disposal. I scrambled to the stone fire pit. My fingers were numb, fumbling blindly in the dark. I grabbed a handful of dry pine needles and struck my magnesium fire starter. The sparks showered over the tinder, illuminating the room in harsh, brief flashes of white light. It took 3 desperate attempts before the needles caught, casting a weak, flickering orange glow across the heavy timber walls. I fed the fire with small, dry splinters of oak, blowing gently on the embers until a steady flame rose. I turned back to the stranger. I grabbed him by the collar of his soaked, freezing coats and dragged him across the rough wooden floorboards, hauling his dead weight directly in front of the stone hearth. You cannot warm a freezing man in wet clothes. The moisture acts as a thermal siphon, constantly drawing the heat away from the organs. I pulled my hunting knife from my thigh sheath. I didn't bother trying to untangle the frozen knots of his makeshift clothing. I hooked the blade under the thick, wet wool of his outer coat and sliced upward, tearing the fabric apart. I stripped him down to his thermal underwear, peeling the frozen, stiff garments off his body and tossing them into the far corner of the room. His flesh was ice-cold to the touch. The frostbite on his fingers and the tips of his ears was severe, the tissue turning a waxy, sickly white. I grabbed one of my own dry, heavy wool blankets from my sleeping cot and wrapped it tightly around his shivering frame. I dragged my mattress closer to the fire and rolled him onto it. He didn't speak. He didn't open his eyes. His breathing was a shallow, rattling wheeze. Heat wasn't enough. His biological engine was completely out of fuel. Hypothermia drains the body's glycogen reserves. Without calories to burn, his internal furnace couldn't restart, no matter how close he was to the fire. I walked over to the corner of the room where I kept my plastic buckets. I popped the heavy lid off one of the containers. Inside was the crystallized pale amber honey I had hauled up the mountain from the subterranean vault of the apiary. It was the purest, most concentrated form of energy left in the dying world. It was my life insurance. I used the chisel edge of a heavy steel crowbar to chip off a jagged shard of the crystallized sugar. I dropped the solid chunk of honey into a scavenged metal tin and placed it on the hot stones at the edge of the fire pit. I watched the amber glass slowly melt down into a thick, steaming golden syrup. When it was liquid, I wrapped my hand in a rag, grabbed the hot tin, and knelt beside the stranger. I propped his head up against my knee. His skin felt like wet marble. "Drink," I commanded, my voice sounding harsh and foreign in the quiet cabin. It was the first word I had spoken aloud in weeks. I pressed the rim of the hot metal tin against his cracked lips and tipped it slowly. The thick, boiling sugar flowed into his mouth. For a terrifying second, he didn't react. The syrup pooled against his teeth. Then an ancient, autonomic reflex took over. His throat worked. He swallowed. I poured a little more. He swallowed again. A violent, full-body shudder ripped through his frame as the massive, concentrated dose of hyperdense calories hit his starving, freezing stomach. It was an instant, overwhelming spike of biological energy. His eyelids fluttered. Slowly, agonizingly, they opened. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, bloodshot and completely wild with the feral terror of a hunted animal. He looked at the fire. He looked at the heavy timber ceiling. And then, his gaze locked onto my face. He saw the thick canvas jacket. He saw the hunting knife strapped to my thigh. He saw the black barrel of the Mossberg 500 poking over my shoulder. He tried to scramble backward, a pathetic, weak thrashing of his limbs against the wool blanket, but his muscles completely failed him. He collapsed back onto the mattress, gasping for air. "Don't move," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. "You're in a watchtower. The door is locked. The storm is outside. If you try to fight me, I will throw you back out into the snow. Do you understand?" He stared at me, his chest heaving. The sheer, overwhelming reality of the heat and the sugar in his veins finally broke through his panic. The tension drained out of his emaciated body. He let his head fall back onto the mattress. "I understand," he croaked. His voice was a dry, broken rasp. "What is your name?" I asked, my hand resting casually on the grip of my hunting knife. He swallowed hard, wincing as the hot honey coated his raw throat. "Caleb," he whispered. "Listen to me, Caleb," I said, leaning closer, making sure the firelight illuminated the cold, dead certainty in my eyes. "I saved your life. But I am not a civilized man. This is my shelter. This is my fire. You will stay on that mattress. You will not touch my gear. If you make a sudden movement, if you wake me up in the dark, I will kill you. Nod if you comprehend the rules." Caleb looked at the shotgun. He looked at my scarred face. He gave a slow, weak nod. "Thank you," he breathed, a single tear cutting a track through the grime on his cheek. "Thank you for the fire." I stood up. I backed away from the mattress, retreating to the darkest corner of the room. I sat down on the hard wooden floorboards, the shotgun resting across my knees, my back against the wall. I had let the variable into the equation. The absolute security of my isolation was gone. I watched him sleep by the flickering orange light of the hearth. I told myself I was being smart. I told myself I was maintaining tactical superiority. But deep down, beneath the hardened exterior of the apocalyptic survivor, a pathetic, dangerous warmth was spreading through my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. And in this dead world, that was the most intoxicating, lethal drug of all. The blizzard raged for 6 unbroken days. It was a whiteout of catastrophic proportions, burying the heavy timber watchtower in massive 10-foot drifts of snow. The heavy oak door was sealed shut by a solid wall of ice. We were entirely entombed on the mountain peak, 2 ghosts trapped inside a wooden box, suspended above a dead world. In the apocalypse, trust is not a currency. It is a vulnerability. I had promised myself I would treat Caleb like a hostile prisoner of war. I kept the Mossberg 500 loaded and within arm's reach at all times. I slept in short, fitful bursts of 20 minutes, sitting upright in the corner, the shotgun resting across my chest, my ears straining for the sound of shifting floorboards. But biology and psychology are stubborn, insidious things. The human brain is not wired for perpetual, solitary confinement. It craves narrative. It craves reflection. When you place 2 surviving humans in a 12 by 12 room with a warm fire and a howling storm outside, the walls of paranoia inevitably begin to sweat and crack. Caleb's recovery was slow, but steady. The massive influx of crystallized honey had jump-started his internal furnace, and the smoked venison I rationed out to him rebuilt his atrophied muscles. He was the perfect guest. He was submissive, profoundly grateful, and completely non-threatening. He was a small man, wiry and soft-spoken, with a deferential posture that constantly communicated his awareness of his lower status in the room's hierarchy. He didn't ask questions about my past. He didn't ask how many weapons I had. He didn't pry into the mechanics of my survival. Instead, he made himself useful. On the third day, while I was carefully melting snow in a metal pot over the fire, I watched Caleb drag his battered body off the mattress. He limped over to a pile of rough-hewn pine logs I had stacked near the door. He picked up a small, dull hatchet I had discarded as useless. Without a word, he knelt by the fire pit and began meticulously splitting the logs into perfect, uniform kindling. He worked quietly, efficiently, anticipating the needs of the fire before I even had to ask. It was a small gesture, a microscopic division of labor, but its psychological impact on me was devastating. For a year, every single calorie burned to maintain my existence had been spent by my own muscles. Every drop of water, every splinter of wood, every ounce of security rested entirely on my shoulders. To suddenly see another human being contributing to the survival equation, to feel the crushing, solitary burden lift even a fraction of an inch, was intoxicating. "You don't have to do that," I said, my voice gruff, suspicious of the favor. Caleb paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his grime-streaked forehead. He offered a weak, self-deprecating smile. "I have to earn the heat," he said softly. "I know how this world works. If I'm not an asset, I'm a liability. I just want to be an asset." He went back to chopping the kindling. I watched him, my grip on the shotgun loosening slightly. He understood the math. He wasn't a delusional refugee expecting charity. He was a survivor who knew the brutal economics of the wasteland. The silence in the cabin began to change. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of absolute isolation. It became a shared space. On the fourth night, the wind outside reached a screaming crescendo, violently rattling the heavy timber walls. We were sitting on opposite sides of the stone hearth, the orange firelight painting dancing shadows across the ceiling. I handed him a metal tin filled with hot water and a melted shard of honey. "Where did you come from?" I asked. The question slipped out before my tactical discipline could stop it. I was bored. I was lonely. I wanted a story. Caleb took the tin, warming his scarred, frostbitten hands against the metal. He stared deep into the flames, his gray eyes reflecting a profound manufactured sorrow. "A settlement down in the valley," he said, his voice trembling perfectly. "An old high school gym. There were 30 of us. We thought we had a system. We thought the concrete walls would keep the gangs out." He took a slow sip of the hot sugar water. "They came at night," Caleb continued, a tear welling up and sliding down his cheek, catching the firelight. "They had a bulldozer. They just rammed the loading doors. It wasn't a raid. It was an extermination. I hid in the ventilation ducts. I listened to them kill everyone. My brother. My friends. I stayed in the dark for 2 days until they finished looting. Then I walked into the snow. I've been walking ever since, waiting to freeze." He looked up at me, his face a mask of absolute broken vulnerability. "I was dead," he whispered, "until you opened the door." It was a flawless, compelling narrative. It hit every psychological trigger. It established him as a victim, a man who had lost everything, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and was now kneeling before my hearth in absolute gratitude. My chest tightened. The hardened, ruthless survivor inside me screamed that it was a standard refugee sob story, a scripted plea for sympathy. But the lonely, exhausted human being inside me drank it in like a dying man finding an oasis. I felt a dangerous, powerful surge of empathy. I saw myself in him. I saw the same trauma, the same horrific loss that had driven me to build a fortress on top of a mountain. "You're safe here," I said. The words left my mouth, and I instantly felt a cold spike of dread in my stomach. I had crossed a line. I had offered a guarantee in a world that allowed no guarantees. Caleb smiled, a genuine warm expression that seemed to light up the dark corners of the cabin. "I know," he said. On the 6th day, the storm finally broke. The howling wind died, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. The sunlight pierced the frosted windows of the watchtower, blindingly bright and incredibly cold. We had survived the crucible of the blizzard together. We were a team. I stood up, stretching my cramped muscles. I looked at Caleb. He was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in his coat with a scavenged needle and thread. He looked completely domesticated, completely harmless. I made the fatal, catastrophic mistake that would end my reign in the mountains. I walked over to the corner of the room. I didn't keep the Mossberg raised. I left it leaning against the wall. I pulled the heavy canvas tarp off my stockpile. I revealed the 5 heavy-duty plastic buckets, each filled to the brim with 60 pounds of crystallized, unspoilable, raw honey. "The storm is over," I told him, pointing to the massive hoard of calories. "We have enough food to last the rest of the winter. Tomorrow we dig out the door. We set traps. We rebuild." Caleb stopped sewing. He looked at the plastic buckets. His pale gray eyes widened, reflecting the massive fortune of sugar. "My God," he whispered, awe dripping from his voice. It's a miracle." "It's not a miracle," I said proudly. "It's discipline." I turned my back on him to check the fire. If I had looked closely at his face, if I hadn't been so blinded by the desperate, pathetic relief of having a companion, I would have seen the awe in his eyes shift into something else. I would have seen the cold, calculating, predatory math of a man who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. The morning after the storm broke, the world outside the heavy timber watchtower was a blinding, pristine expanse of white death. The snow had drifted so high against the eastern wall that it completely covered the lower half of the windows. Digging out was not just a chore. It was a desperate excavation to reclaim our access to the surface. I handed Caleb a crude, heavy shovel I had fashioned from a piece of rusted corrugated steel and a pine branch. I took the other. Together, we attacked the wall of packed ice and snow blocking the heavy oak front door. Physical labor in freezing temperatures is a brutally intimate experience. You hear the other man's ragged breathing. You smell the sour, metallic sweat of exertion. You match your rhythm to his. Every shovelful of snow we threw over the wooden railing of the wraparound deck felt like a brick being laid in the foundation of a new, shared civilization. Caleb was weak, his muscles still recovering from the profound trauma of his hypothermia, but he didn't complain. He worked with a grim, determined focus, his jaw set, his pale gray eyes fixed on the ice. He was proving his worth. He was paying his rent in calories burned. It took us 4 hours to clear the deck and carve a trench down the steep wooden stairs to the ground level of the ridge. When we finally broke through to the frozen earth, we collapsed against the snowbanks, our chests heaving, steam rising from our scavenged coats in the freezing, brilliant sunlight. Caleb looked at me and let out a breathless, exhausted laugh. It was a sound I hadn't heard in a year. It wasn't the manic, hysterical laughter of a starving scavenger. It was the genuine, relieved sound of a man who had accomplished a hard task and lived to see the sun. I found myself smiling back. It was a microscopic flexing of facial muscles, but it felt like a tectonic shift in my psychology. The ice around my heart was thawing just as surely as the snow melting near the fire pit. Over the next 2 weeks, the false brotherhood cemented itself into my daily routine. Caleb was a master of making himself indispensable. He didn't challenge my authority. He didn't question my decisions. He seamlessly integrated himself into the massive, endless workload of survival. He noticed that hauling the heavy dead pine logs up the ridge for firewood was rapidly depleting our caloric reserves. One afternoon, while I was checking a snare line a quarter-mile from the tower, Caleb dismantled a broken, rusted metal shelving unit he found buried under the snow near the base of the tower. Using my heavy utility knife and a spool of scavenged copper wire, he fashioned the metal tracks and a piece of smooth tin roofing into a crude, incredibly efficient drag sled. When I returned, exhausted and empty-handed, he proudly presented it to me. "It distributes the weight," Caleb explained, his tone deferential but eager. "We can haul 3 times the wood with half the effort. It glides right over the crust of the snow." I stared at the sled. It was a brilliant, simple piece of engineering. It solved a massive logistical problem. "Good work," I grunted, clapping him firmly on the shoulder. I felt a surge of pride. I had saved this man from the void, and he was returning the investment tenfold. We were a team. We were 2 capable men pushing back against the apocalypse, carving out a kingdom in the dead pines. That was the tragedy of my isolation. I was so starved for validation, so desperate for an ally, that I didn't see what he was actually building. Caleb wasn't just building a sled for firewood. He was building a transport vehicle capable of moving hundreds of pounds of cargo across the frozen terrain. He was building his getaway car right in front of my eyes, and I was congratulating him for it. His manipulation was a masterclass in psychological infiltration. He began to ask questions about the geography of the mountain. He didn't ask where the nearest settlements were. He asked where the most dangerous ravines were located, claiming he wanted to ensure he never accidentally wandered into a trap while gathering wood. I, eager to share my hard-won knowledge of the terrain, drew crude maps in the ash of the stone hearth. I showed him the blind drops, the impassable ridges, and most fatally, the single, hidden logging road that offered a clear, gradual descent down the eastern face of the mountain. My emergency escape route. He studied the ash maps with intense, focused eyes, nodding solemnly, committing every topographical contour to memory. The final, catastrophic collapse of my perimeter defenses happened without a single shot being fired. It happened on a Tuesday evening. We were sitting by the fire, digesting a rich, heavy meal of smoked venison glazed in the raw, crystallized honey. I stood up to fetch more water. I left the Mossberg 500 shotgun leaning against the heavy timber wall, exactly 5 feet away from where Caleb was sitting. For 12 months, that weapon had been an extension of my own body. It had never been more than arm's length away. It was my iron spine. I walked across the room, poured the water, and walked back. Caleb hadn't moved. He hadn't even looked at the gun. He was just staring placidly into the flames. The subconscious realization that I could turn my back on a living human being and not be immediately murdered washed over me like a warm narcotic wave. The exhausting, burning hypervigilance that had kept my nervous system on fire for a year finally, blessedly, shut down. I sat back down. I didn't move the shotgun closer. I looked at Caleb, the man I had pulled from the ice, the man who chopped my wood and built my sleds. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I had won. I had beaten the mathematics of the wasteland. I didn't know that Caleb was simply waiting for my eyes to close. Exhaustion in the apocalypse is a cumulative poison. It builds up in your bone marrow, layer by layer, month by month. The constant adrenaline, the fractured 20-minute sleep cycles, the perpetual terror of the dark, it hollows you out. When your brain finally registers that it is safe, when the paranoid perimeter alarms in your amygdala are switched off, the physiological crash is devastating. You don't just fall asleep, you descend into a coma. It was the 18th night since Caleb had tumbled through my doorway. The temperature outside was holding steady at 20 below zero, but the heavy timber watchtower was suffocatingly warm. We had spent the entire day hauling massive loads of dead pine up the ridge using Caleb's tin sled. My muscles were screaming, trembling with the deep, satisfying ache of productive labor. We ate a massive dinner. I was generous. I scooped 2 heavy, jagged shards of the raw, crystallized honey from the plastic buckets and melted them down into a thick, boiling syrup, mixing it with pine needle tea. Caleb insisted on cooking. He insisted on preparing the drinks. "You did the heavy lifting today on the ridge," Caleb said softly, handing me the steaming, battered metal tin. His gray eyes were warm, reflecting the orange firelight. "Drink. Rest. I'll take the first watch. I'll keep the fire burning." I took the tin. The sweet, pine-scented steam washed over my face. It was the ultimate luxury. The promise of uninterrupted sleep. The knowledge that another human being was standing guard, feeding the flames, watching the shadows so I didn't have to. "Wake me in 4 hours," I murmured, taking a long, deep pull of the hot, sugary liquid. It tasted incredibly rich. A perfect, heavy sweetness. I drank the entire tin, feeling the heat radiate outward from my stomach, unlocking the tight, agonizing knots in my lower back. I didn't suspect a thing. I didn't think about the scavenged military-grade medical kit I kept in an unlocked metal lockbox near my sleeping cot. I didn't think about the heavy, expired blister packs of powerful central nervous system depressants, muscle relaxers, and heavy sedatives I had hoarded in case of a catastrophic injury like a broken leg. I had shown Caleb where the medical kit was days ago, proudly displaying my preparedness. I lay back on my mattress, pulling the heavy wool blanket over my chest. The crackle of the dry pine logs in the stone hearth was a hypnotic, rhythmic lullaby. I looked across the fire at Caleb. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, staring into the flames. 4 hours, I mumbled, my eyelids suddenly feeling as though they were made of lead. "Sleep well," Caleb whispered. The darkness rushed up to meet me. It wasn't the shallow, fractured sleep of a survivor. It was a deep, paralyzing chemical blackness. I plunged into a void without dreams, without awareness, utterly disconnected from the physical world. I don't know how long I was under. I woke to a sensation of profound, biting agony. It wasn't a sudden awakening. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through a thick layer of cognitive mud. My brain felt swollen, heavy, and disconnected from my limbs. My mouth was dry, tasting of old copper and stale sugar. But it was the cold that finally forced my eyes open. A brutal sub-zero chill had settled into the room, cutting through my wool blanket and sinking directly into my bones. I blinked, my vision blurry and swimming. The heavy timber watchtower was pitch black. The comforting, rhythmic crackle of the fire was gone. I rolled my heavy, uncoordinated head toward the center of the room. The stone hearth was dead. Not a single ember glowed. The ashes were completely cold. The fire hadn't just died. It had been dead for hours. Panic, slow and sluggish from the drugs, began to bloom in my chest. I tried to sit up, but my arms trembled violently, failing to support my body weight. I collapsed back onto the mattress, my breath pluming in the freezing air. "Caleb," I croaked. My voice was a weak, pathetic rasp. Silence. The heavy, oppressive silence of absolute isolation. I forced myself onto my elbows, fighting the sickening vertigo spinning in my skull. I squinted into the gloom, my eyes slowly adjusting to the faint, ambient moonlight filtering through the frosted windows. I looked toward the corner of the room where the Mossberg 500 shotgun always leaned against the timber wall. The wall was empty. A cold spike of pure, unadulterated terror pierced the chemical fog in my brain. The adrenaline finally hit, a massive, shocking dose that cleared the lethargy from my muscles. I scrambled to my feet, swaying drunkenly, knocking over the empty metal tin beside my mattress. I turned toward the opposite corner, the darkest part of the room, where I kept my life insurance. The heavy canvas tarp I used to cover my stockpile was thrown aside, crumpled uselessly on the floorboards. The 5 heavy-duty plastic buckets, containing 300 pounds of crystallized, unspoilable, raw honey, were gone. Every single calorie I possessed. Gone. "No," I whispered, the sound tearing from my dry throat. "No, no, no." I stumbled across the dark room, my bare feet slapping against the freezing wood. I reached the heavy oak front door. The iron deadbolt on the inside was thrown open. I grabbed the heavy iron handle and yanked inward. The door didn't budge. It moved a fraction of an inch, emitting a dull, heavy wooden thud, and then stopped completely. I planted my boots, gripped the handle with both hands, and pulled with every ounce of my frantic, panicked strength. I roared, a guttural sound of pure, helpless rage, pulling until the muscles in my back screamed and my vision blacked out at the edges. The door was immovable. It wasn't frozen shut. The impact sound was structural. Caleb hadn't just taken the shotgun. He hadn't just loaded 300 pounds of my survival onto the tin sled he had built right in front of my face. Before he walked away into the night, he had used the heavy nylon climbing rope from my own gear stash. He had tied the exterior handle of the oak door to the massive load-bearing timber pillars of the wraparound deck, lashing it so tight it effectively bolted the door to the frame from the outside. He had taken my food. He had taken my weapon. And he had locked me inside my own watchtower to freeze and starve in the dark. I sank to my knees on the freezing floorboards, my bloody fingers slipping off the iron handle. The invisible man in the supercenter had tried to break my psychology with a game. But Caleb, the fragile, pathetic stranger I had pulled from the ice, had actually done it. He had used my own mercy to cut my throat. The wall of isolation hadn't protected me. It had just made me a perfectly preserved, incredibly naive mark. And the cost of that lesson was everything I had. Panic in a sealed environment is a dangerous, oxygen-consuming flame. It flares up, burns out your rational thought, and leaves you exhausted and vulnerable to the cold. I spent the first hour after waking from the drugged sleep throwing my battered body against the heavy oak door. I screamed, I cursed, I kicked the solid wood until the side of my boot split and my toes went numb. The heavy nylon climbing rope Caleb had lashed around the exterior handle, and the timber pillars of the deck didn't stretch a single millimeter. It was a structural knot, tied by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I was burning precious calories on rage. I had to stop. I slid down the rough wood of the door, collapsing onto the freezing floorboards, my back resting against the barrier that was now my tombstone. The heavy timber watchtower, which had been a flawless tactical redoubt yesterday, was now a slowly freezing coffin. I forced myself to breathe slowly, in through my nose, out through my mouth, fighting the lingering, sluggish effects of the sedatives Caleb had slipped into my honey tea. The chemical fog in my brain made it difficult to hold a complete thought, but the brutal, mathematical reality of my situation cut through the haze. Rule number 1 of the Apocalypse: inventory everything. I pushed myself up from the floor, my joints popping loudly in the silent, freezing cabin. I walked back to the center of the room. The ambient light from the moon reflecting off the snow outside cast long, pale, distorted shadows through the frosted windows. I assessed the damage. Caleb hadn't just taken the 5 heavy-duty plastic buckets containing 300 pounds of crystallized raw honey. He had been meticulous. He was a professional parasite. The Mossberg 500 shotgun and my bandolier of heavy red 00 buckshot shells were gone. My heavy, waterproof winter boots, the ones I had scavenged from the Supercenter parking lot, were missing from beside the dead stone hearth. He had left me his rotting, torn, freezing canvas boots. My secondary hunting knife, the smaller utility blade I used for skinning snares, was gone. He had taken the magnesium fire starter. He had taken the heavy, insulated sleeping bag. He had taken the tin drag sled he had built to haul the firewood. He had stripped me of my ability to make heat, my ability to hunt, my ability to travel, and my ability to defend myself. He had surgically removed every variable necessary for biological survival, leaving me with nothing but the heavy timber walls and the freezing air. I walked over to the corner where I kept my secondary, less valuable supplies. He had left my original heavy hunting knife, the one I had used to butcher the deer and fight the feral dogs. Perhaps he thought it was too heavy, or perhaps he just forgot it in his rush to load the massive weight of the honey onto the sled. He had left my heavy canvas jacket, likely because it was covered in the dried black blood of the siege at the apiary, and he had his own layered coats. And he had left the wood. A massive towering pile of split pine logs I had hauled up the ridge over the last 2 weeks. It was a cruel, ironic joke. I had a mountain of fuel, but no spark. I sat down on my mattress, pulling the thin remaining wool blanket tight around my shoulders. The temperature inside the watchtower was dropping rapidly, matching the sub-zero chill of the mountain air outside. Without the radiant heat of the stone fire pit, the thick timber walls were just cold, dead wood. The timeline of my death was suddenly very clear, laid out in undeniable biological stages. Without heat, my core temperature would drop below 95 degrees Fahrenheit within 6 hours. The shivering would become violent and uncontrollable as my muscles frantically tried to generate warmth. My fine motor skills would vanish. Within 12 hours, as my core temperature dropped further, the shivering would stop. That is the terrifying turning point. The body abandons the extremities, pulling all remaining blood to the vital organs to protect the heart and brain. My fingers and toes would succumb to severe frostbite, turning white, then black, dying while attached to my living body. Confusion and lethargy would set in, a symptom of the slowing chemical reactions in my brain. Without food to stoke my internal furnace, to provide the glycogen necessary to fight the cold, the process would accelerate. My body, starved of the hyperdense calories I had relied on for months, would begin to consume its own muscle tissue, a desperate cannibalistic act of self-preservation. By the 24-hour mark, I would slip into a profound apathetic stupor. The pain of the cold would mysteriously vanish, replaced by a deceptive, warm hallucination, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. I would likely tear off my clothes in the freezing dark, convinced I was burning up, just before my heart finally fibrillated and stopped. I had one day. 24 hours before the watchtower became a permanent, frozen monument to my own stupidity. I looked at the frosted windows. They were small, square panes of heavy, reinforced glass set high in the timber walls, designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. They were too small to crawl through, even if I managed to shatter them. And shattering them would only let the freezing wind in faster. The heavy oak door was the only exit. I looked at my heavy hunting knife lying on the floorboards. The 6-inch carbon steel blade glinted dully in the moonlight. I couldn't cut the nylon rope from the inside. The knot was lashed around the exterior handle and the thick timber pillars of the deck. I was separated from the ropes by 4 inches of solid, old-growth oak wood. I picked up the knife. The handle was freezing cold. If I wanted to live, I couldn't just sit on the mattress and wait for the hypothermia to take my mind. I had to go to war with the architecture. 4 inches of solid oak is not a barrier. It is a fortress wall. When you are starving, drugged, and freezing, it might as well be solid steel. I walked over to the heavy front door, the 6-inch carbon steel blade of my hunting knife tight in my right hand. I didn't test the iron handle again. I knew it was useless. I dropped to my knees, shivering violently in the sub-zero air of the dark cabin, and examined the wooden planks that made up the door. They were massive vertical slabs of old-growth timber, bolted together with heavy iron rivets. The gaps between the planks were microscopic, sealed tight by age and the freezing temperatures. My plan was primitive, born of absolute, desperate necessity. I had to carve a hole through the solid oak large enough to reach my arm through the gap, grasp the exterior handle, and cut the heavy nylon climbing rope Caleb had lashed around the deck pillars. I gripped the handle of the hunting knife with both hands, raised it above my head, and brought the point down violently into the seam between the 2 central oak planks, near the iron door handle. Thwack! The sound was dull and hard. The impact jarred my wrists, sending a sharp, sickening spike of pain shooting up my forearms. The heavy carbon steel blade, designed for butchering meat and severing joints, barely penetrated 1/4 of an inch into the freezing dense wood. I yanked the blade free, gritting my teeth, and struck again. And again. And again. I established a frantic, manic rhythm, driving the tip of the knife into the wood, twisting the blade, trying to pry loose splinters of the solid oak. I was a rat gnawing at a concrete wall. Minutes turned into hours. The physical exertion in the freezing air was devastating. Sweat poured down my face, instantly cooling and stinging my eyes. My breath plumed in thick, ragged white clouds. My hands, gripping the knife, were becoming clumsy and numb, the early stages of frostbite gnawing at my fingertips. I stopped swinging, leaning my forehead against the heavy, freezing wood of the door, panting heavily. I looked at my progress. It was pathetic. I had managed to gouge a shallow, jagged trench into the seam, barely 1/2 inch deep and 3 inches long. The wood was incredibly hard, petrified by the cold and decades of exposure to the mountain air. At this rate, I would die of exhaustion and hypothermia before I breached the first inch of the 4-inch barrier. Think, I whispered to myself, my voice cracking, a harsh sound in the silent cabin. You're an engineer. You understand mechanics. Think. I stepped back from the door, wiping the freezing sweat from my forehead with the back of my trembling, numb hand. I looked around the pitch-black room, the faint moonlight casting long, distorted shadows across the dead stone fire pit and the towering pile of split pine logs. My eyes landed on the rusted metal tracks of the tin drag sled Caleb had dismantled. He had taken the sled, but he had left the discarded heavy-duty metal shelving brackets he had used to fashion the runners. They were thick L-shaped pieces of industrial steel, about 18 inches long, with pre-drilled holes for heavy bolts. I walked over to the corner and picked one up. It was heavy, rigid, and freezing cold. I looked at the heavy hunting knife in my right hand. The blade was strong, but the handle was designed for a human grip, not for absorbing the massive kinetic energy required to chisel through solid oak. I walked back to the stone fire pit. I grabbed a heavy, smooth, fist-sized river stone from the hearth, one I had hauled up the mountain months ago to build the fire ring. I returned to the heavy oak door. I placed the tip of the hunting knife directly into the shallow, jagged trench I had carved between the planks. I held the handle of the knife steady with my left hand. I raised the heavy river stone in my right hand and brought it down violently, striking the flat, brass-capped pommel of the hunting knife. Crack! The sound was sharp and deafening. The impact drove the carbon steel blade deeply into the freezing oak. The knife sank nearly an inch, wedging tightly between the dense fibers of the wood. It worked. I was no longer stabbing the door. I was using the knife as a wedge and the heavy stone as a hammer. It was a crude, brutal chisel. I struck the pommel of the knife again, and again, and again. The noise was horrific, a relentless, mechanical pounding that vibrated through my bones and echoed loudly against the heavy timber walls of the watchtower. The brass pommel of the knife began to deform under the massive, repeated impacts of the heavy river stone. My left hand, holding the handle steady, was bruised and bleeding, the shock waves tearing the skin. But the blade was biting deeper. I worked the knife up and down the seam, driving it in, twisting it violently to splinter the oak, then pulling it free and starting again. The pile of wood chips and thick, heavy splinters gathering at the base of the door slowly began to grow. I lost all sense of time. The moonlight shifted slowly across the floorboards, measuring the terrifying advance of the night. The cold was an aggressive, physical entity now. I could no longer feel my toes inside Caleb's rotting canvas boots. The shivering had stopped, the terrifying biological indicator that my core temperature was dropping below the critical threshold. My movements became sluggish, uncoordinated, driven entirely by sheer primal panic rather than muscle memory. I struck the pommel of the knife one final, desperate time. Crunch. The resistance vanished. The 6-inch carbon steel blade plunged entirely through the thick oak plank, hitting empty air on the other side. I stopped swinging the heavy stone. I let my head fall against the freezing wood of the door, gasping for air, tears of pure, agonizing effort freezing on my cheeks. I had breached the wall. I grabbed the handle of the knife with both hands and wrenched it back and forth, violently widening the hole, snapping the remaining fibers of the oak. I pulled the blade free. There, near the iron handle, was a jagged, uneven hole in the solid wood, about 3 inches wide and 6 inches high. It was just barely large enough. I dropped the heavy river stone and the hunting knife onto the floorboards. I took a deep, ragged breath, fighting the dizziness swirling in my skull, and shoved my right arm into the jagged hole. Shoving your bare arm through a splintered hole in a 4-inch oak door is an act of sheer, terrifying desperation. The jagged edges of the wood tore immediately at the fabric of my canvas jacket, biting deep into the flesh of my forearm. I ignored the warm trickle of blood running down my wrist. The cold outside the cabin was absolute. The moment my hand passed through the threshold, the sub-zero wind howled around my knuckles, instantly numbing my fingers. I stretched my arm, twisting my shoulder awkwardly against the heavy door, reaching blindly in the dark for the exterior iron handle. My frozen fingertips brushed against it. I felt the thick, abrasive texture of the heavy nylon climbing rope Caleb had lashed around the metal. It was pulled incredibly taut, vibrating slightly in the wind like a guitar string. He hadn't just tied a simple knot. He had wrapped it multiple times, creating a dense, impenetrable knot of synthetic fiber. I pulled my arm back inside the freezing cabin, gasping as the splintered wood scraped across my bleeding skin again. I grabbed my heavy hunting knife from the floorboards. The brass pommel was severely deformed from being used as a chisel, but the carbon steel blade was still razor-sharp. I had to cut the rope completely blind, using only the tactile feedback of my freezing, uncoordinated fingers, while my core temperature plummeted toward the fatal threshold. I shoved my right arm back through the jagged hole, gripping the knife tightly. I found the taut nylon rope again. I pressed the blade against the thickest part of the knot, angled it away from my own flesh, and began to saw. The nylon was incredibly tough, designed to hold the weight of a falling climber. The cold made it rigid, almost petrified. I sawed back and forth, putting all my remaining pathetic strength into my shoulder. The blade bit into the synthetic fibers, slipping occasionally, slicing shallow cuts into my own knuckles. I couldn't feel the pain. I couldn't feel anything below my elbow. I worked for what felt like an eternity, the howling wind outside mocking my frantic, microscopic progress. My breathing was incredibly shallow, my vision tunneling to a single dark point in the center of the cabin. The lethal apathy of late-stage hypothermia was creeping into my brain, whispering that it would be so much easier to just pull my arm inside, lie down on the mattress, and go to sleep. "Cut!" I grunted aloud, a harsh, guttural sound that startled me in the silence. "Cut it!" I sawed violently, a final manic burst of energy fueled entirely by rage. I wasn't going to die because of Caleb. I wasn't going to let the parasite win. Snap! The sound was sharp and sudden. The tension on the heavy nylon rope vanished instantly. The thick knot unraveled under the pressure of the blade. The heavy oak door shifted inward a fraction of an inch, groaning loudly on its iron hinges. I ripped my bleeding arm back through the hole, dropping the hunting knife onto the floorboards. I scrambled to my feet, swaying unsteadily, my heart hammering a chaotic, desperate rhythm. I grabbed the heavy iron handle on the inside of the door. I threw my body weight backward, pulling with everything I had left. The door didn't resist. It swung wide open, the hinges screaming in protest, slamming heavily against the interior timber wall of the watchtower. The freezing mountain wind blasted into the cabin, hitting my face like a physical wall of ice. The moonlight illuminated the massive 10-foot snowdrifts piled against the deck. I had breached the tomb. I was free. But freedom is a hollow victory when you are starving, freezing, and completely exposed to the apocalypse. I stumbled out onto the wraparound deck, my boots crunching heavily on the frozen, packed snow. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, causing me to cough violently, dropping to one knee. I looked down the long, steep ridge leading to the valley below. The snow was pristine and untouched, stretching for miles in the brilliant, blinding moonlight, except for a single deep set of tracks. The tracks were a continuous, heavy groove carved through the crust of the snow, flanked by 2 deep boot prints. It was the unmistakable signature of the tin drag sled, loaded down with 300 pounds of crystallized honey, heading straight down the hidden logging road I had stupidly drawn for him in the ashes of the hearth. Caleb had a massive head start. He was moving downhill, and he was carrying the calories required to survive the journey. I looked back at the open door of the watchtower. The stone fire pit was dead. The heavy timber walls were useless without heat. I had no shotgun, no fire starter, no food, and no heavy winter boots. If I stayed in the cabin, I would freeze to death before noon. If I followed the tracks down the mountain, wearing rotting canvas boots and a torn jacket, I would freeze to death on the trail. Caleb had calculated the math perfectly. He had left me an impossible equation. I stood up, gripping the wooden railing of the deck. I looked at the deep groove carved into the snow by the sled. The rage that had fueled my escape from the cabin coalesced into a cold, terrifying clarity. I wasn't going to sit in the dark and wait for the end. I wasn't going to let the thief inherit my kingdom. I walked back into the freezing cabin. I picked up my heavy hunting knife from the floorboards, gripping the deformed brass pommel. I walked out onto the deck, stepping off the wooden planks and plunging into the thigh-deep snow of the ridge. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't say goodbye to the watchtower. I just lowered my head, gritted my teeth against the brutal wind, and began to follow the tracks of the ghost down the mountain. Following a trail in the dead of winter is not hunting. It is an act of sheer, agonizing attrition. The physical toll on a body already pushed past the brink of hypothermia is staggering. My muscles, starved of glycogen and burning the last reserves of my own tissue, felt like lead. The rotting canvas boots Caleb had left me were entirely inadequate. Within the first mile, my toes were completely numb, the snow packing inside the canvas and freezing into solid blocks of ice against my skin. I moved mechanically, placing one frozen foot in front of the other, following the deep, heavy groove of the tin drag sled. The moonlight was my only ally. It illuminated the hidden logging road perfectly, casting sharp, stark shadows across the pristine snow. The trail was easy to read. Caleb was moving quickly, but the massive weight of the 300 pounds of honey was slowing him down. The sled tracks dug deep into the crust, occasionally veering wildly where he had struggled to control the momentum on the steeper descents. He was strong, fueled by the theft of my calories, but he wasn't a mountain native. He was a valley scavenger. He didn't know the rhythm of the high country. I didn't stop to rest. Resting meant freezing. I pushed myself down the logging road, my breathing a ragged, whistling wheeze that echoed in the silent, dead forest. The trail descended rapidly, dropping hundreds of feet in elevation. The temperature rose slightly as I left the exposed peak of the watchtower, but it was still well below zero. The dead pine trees grew thicker here, their blackened branches interlocking like skeletal fingers over the trail. By dawn, the sky turned a bruised, sickly gray, the sun hidden behind a thick, impenetrable layer of overcast clouds. The wind died down, leaving the forest in a heavy, oppressive silence. I reached a sharp, hairpin turn in the logging road. I stopped, leaning heavily against the trunk of a dead oak tree, my chest heaving. I looked down at the sled tracks. The deep, continuous groove suddenly stopped. The snow was churned up, a chaotic mess of boot prints and disturbed crust. Caleb had stopped here. He had rested. I knelt in the snow, ignoring the burning agony in my knees. I touched the disturbed snow. It was still soft, the edges of the boot prints sharp and clean. He wasn't far ahead. And then I saw it. Sitting perfectly in the center of the churned snow was a small, heavy-duty plastic bucket. It was one of the 5 buckets I had hauled up from the apiary. I crawled toward it, my frozen fingers gripping the rim. I pulled the heavy lid off. It was completely empty. Caleb hadn't stopped to rest. He had stopped to lighten his load. The sheer crushing weight of 300 pounds of crystallized honey on a tin sled was too much for one man to drag through the deep snow, even going downhill. He had been forced to abandon 60 pounds of raw calories, dumping the precious life-saving sugar directly into the snowbanks somewhere off the trail. I stared at the empty bucket. The sheer, staggering waste of the act made my vision swim with rage. He was throwing away my life insurance just to increase his speed. I dropped the empty bucket into the snow. I didn't bother looking for the dumped honey. It was buried, useless. I stood up, the anger burning away the lethargy of the hypothermia. The trail was fresh. He had sacrificed the cargo to run faster. He knew I was coming. I resumed the chase, my pace quickening from a mechanical shuffle to a frantic, agonizing jog. The rotting canvas boots slapped loudly against the packed snow of the sled track. An hour later, I found the second empty bucket. Half a mile later, the third. He was bleeding his treasure. He was panicking. The heavy tin sled was a burden, and the steep descent of the logging road was turning the massive weight into a runaway train. I crested a small ridge overlooking a deep, narrow ravine. The logging road switchbacked sharply to the left, hugging the edge of the steep drop-off. I looked down at the sled tracks. They didn't make the turn. The heavy groove of the tin sled went straight over the edge of the ravine, carving a massive, chaotic path of destruction through the dead brush and the snow before disappearing into the shadows below. Caleb had lost control. The massive weight of the remaining honey had carried the sled over the embankment, taking him with it. I walked to the edge of the ravine, the snow crumbling beneath my frozen boots. I looked down into the gloom. 50 feet below, tangled in the branches of a fallen pine tree, was the tin drag sled. And lying motionless beside it, a dark shape against the white snow, was Caleb. I had found the ghost, and he had broken his own neck on my property. The descent into the ravine was not a climb. It was a controlled, agonizing fall. I slid down the steep embankment on my back, the freezing snow packing into my collar and sleeves, my hands gripping the exposed roots of the dead trees to slow my momentum. I hit the bottom of the ravine with a heavy thud, the impact sending a jarring shockwave through my frozen, exhausted body. I lay in the snow for a minute, staring up at the gray sky through the skeletal branches of the pines. My heart was hammering a chaotic, irregular rhythm. The profound, apathetic warmth of late-stage hypothermia was finally sinking into my brain. I felt a terrifying, overwhelming urge to simply close my eyes and go to sleep in the snow. I forced myself onto my hands and knees. I grabbed the heavy hunting knife from my belt, using the ruined brass pommel to push myself upright. I stumbled toward the wreckage of the sled. The tin roofing Caleb had used for the runners was twisted and warped. The heavy nylon ropes he had used to lash the cargo were snapped. Lying in the snow, scattered around the ruined sled, were the 2 remaining heavy-duty plastic buckets. They had burst open on impact, spilling their contents. 120 pounds of crystallized raw honey was shattered across the frozen ground. The pale amber shards glinted dully in the gray light. A massive, priceless fortune of calories spilled like broken glass in the dirt. I walked past the ruined treasure. I approached the dark shape lying next to the fallen pine tree. It was Caleb. He was lying on his back, his heavy winter coats torn by the fall. His right leg was bent at a horrific, unnatural angle, the femur completely shattered. But he wasn't dead. His pale gray eyes were wide open, staring at the sky. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid gasps. Blood leaked from the corner of his mouth, freezing into a dark crimson crust against his pale cheek. He heard my boots crunching in the snow. He slowly turned his head, wincing in agony. He saw me standing over him, covered in snow, my canvas jacket torn, holding the heavy hunting knife. He saw the monster he had created. "You," Caleb whispered, his voice a bubbling, wet rasp. "You got out." "I cut the rope," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of anger or triumph. It was just a statement of mechanical fact. He coughed, a violent spasm that sent a fresh wave of blood spilling down his chin. He looked at the shattered plastic buckets and the spilled honey. "I couldn't control it," he wheezed, tears of sheer, pathetic pain leaking from his eyes. "The weight. It was too heavy. The sled pulled me over." He looked back up at me, his eyes pleading, searching for the mercy he had exploited in the watchtower. "Help me," Caleb begged, raising a trembling, frostbitten hand toward my knees. "My leg is broken. I can't walk. I'll freeze down here." I stared at him. I looked at the man who had eaten my food, slept by my fire, and built a sled specifically to steal my survival. I looked at the man who had lashed my door shut, intending to leave me to starve and freeze in the dark without a single moment of hesitation. The apocalypse is a brutal teacher. It strips away the illusions of civilization. It teaches you that mercy is an anomaly, a glitch in the software of survival. "You stole my food," I said softly, stepping closer to his broken body. "You stole my shotgun. You stole my fire." I knelt beside him in the snow. I didn't raise the hunting knife. I didn't need to kill him. The mountain had already done the work. I reached past his trembling hand. I reached into the deep pocket of his heavy winter coat, the coat he had been wearing when he collapsed on my porch. My frozen fingers found the cold, hard plastic. I pulled out my magnesium fire starter. Caleb watched me take it. his eyes widening in absolute terror as he realized what I was doing. I didn't stop. I reached into his other pocket. I pulled out my secondary hunting knife. I reached into his inner pocket and retrieved the heavy military-grade medical kit containing the sedatives he had used to drug me. I systematically stripped him of every stolen asset, reclaiming my inventory with the cold mechanical efficiency of a predator. "Please," Caleb sobbed, his voice breaking, the reality of his doom finally crashing down on him. "Don't leave me here. You saved me. You're a good man." I stood up, securing the fire starter and the medical kit in my torn jacket. I looked down at the thief, bleeding out in the snow, surrounded by the shattered ruins of the kingdom he had tried to steal. "I was a good man," I corrected him, turning my back on his broken body. "But you cured me." I didn't look back as I walked away. I walked past the ruined sled. I knelt in the snow and gathered a massive, jagged shard of the spilled, crystallized honey, shoving it into my pocket. I began the agonizing vertical climb out of the ravine, leaving Caleb to the freezing wind and the absolute silence of the mountain. I had lost my watchtower, my shotgun, and most of my food. But I had my fire. I had my calories. And I had finally, permanently, sealed the crack in my armor. I would never open a door again.